Bankruptcy, the way I was raised, is a filthy word and something that only quitters would ever do, especially if you're working class, because a real man pays his debts. And boy, did I have a lot of debt. And the reason that I led this video with the word bankruptcy is because I made a video about this shortly after going bankrupt 7 years ago, and I didn't say the word bankruptcy until 15 minutes and 48 seconds into the video because I was so scared and so ashamed, but I still felt the need to tell the story because it had been driving me to an early grave. I was so stressed, I was so underwater, and I was struggling so much for a very, very long time that I finally pulled the plug, went for bankruptcy, and then didn't tell anybody until it was all said and done, and my debts were discharged on February 7th, 2018, making it 7 years ago to the day on February 7th, 2025 that I filed for Chapter 7, and thankfully it went through just fine. And it also means that 7 years later, it ends that chapter of my life completely and fades off of my credit score forever. The average sane person would probably gather all those documents, shove them into a barrel fire, and walk away whistling happy, never to think about it ever again for the rest of their life. But that's not the deal that I have with you if you watch me on my channel. And as CNBC dug into my finances over the last few weeks and asked me a whole bunch of pointed questions and were very interested in my bankruptcy, and it's the 7-year anniversary of discharging my debt, I figured that it was the perfect time to dive into it, and maybe in a little bit more detail than I've ever done before in a video, and explain to you how I got in that situation, why I didn't get myself out of it sooner, why I finally did, and most importantly, what I learned from it. Because I'm sure there are a lot of people out there that are struggling with a mountain of debt right now. If those statistics on this are remotely accurate, Americans are buried under more consumer debt than any time in our previous history. Things are tough for a lot of people right now, and I probably should disclaim that this is not financial or legal advice. I am not an expert. You should take everything I say in this video with a grain of salt, because this is a story that started a good decade ago and ended for me a good 7 years ago. And while it took me a while to process it, it happened in one of the most stressful, darkest times of my life. So even some of the details are a little bit hazy. I do have the documentation, however, so we do know that I was $86,500.06 in debt, not including the $33,000 that I owed for my student loans. I was making $2,013 a month, and I was paying $2,270 a month to my creditors, which it's untenable. You can't spend more than you make and survive. And we'll get into how I got there here in a second. Thankfully, I actually wrote a book about this period of my life and those surrounding it, the story of how I got to Paris. And I dug into this just to do a little bit of research and see where I was at, to remind myself of what was going on. I really thought I was going to cringe reading this because I have not read this since I published it in 2020. But it turned out it was actually a really good book. So if you want more details surrounding all of this and the whole story of how I got myself to Paris and made it stick all the way up to about 2020, I actually would recommend reading my book. It's really good. I should promote this more often. I never talk about it because I'm kind of embarrassed that I even wrote it. I shouldn't be. It's really good. Moving on. How did I find myself in such dire straits? I'll give you a little bit of the setup here. It starts with financial illiteracy and not being raised with any idea of how to handle money. That's not to say I didn't get raised with a work ethic. I got raised with a really, really strong work ethic, like puritanical levels of work ethic, surrounded by engineers and farmers and cowboys and professors, people that worked really hard and were very smart and put a lot of effort in. And so I started working from a very early age, mowing lawns, selling newspaper subscriptions to college students when I was like 12 years old, which is a really difficult job. Selling newspapers to anybody is already hard enough, but try doing it to cash-strapped college students and you're in for a completely different level of treat. I worked really, really hard, but I also just kind of spent all the money that I had, which is understandable because I was a kid, right? But I wasn't really raised in a family that supported me financially and also didn't yet know how to deal with money themselves. My grandparents on my mom's side were very post-depression, locked down, very, very tight with their money. They didn't really teach me anything to do with it, but they did definitely lock it in, and they lived kind of what we think of as the traditional invest in your retirement, get to retirement, and then enjoy retirement mindset, and that really worked for them. My dad's parents were very different in that his dad was very good with money, as stories go, had invested, built some apartment buildings in our hometown, had invested and made a little empire for himself, but unfortunately passed away when my dad was small. And then that side of the family just kind of squandered everything until, my grandma landed herself in some pretty significant poverty before the end of her life. So that was a little bit of a downhill thing. Unfortunately, the combination of those two families left us with an inability to really handle money well, but also an unwillingness to spend it, or especially spend it on we, the children. So I grew up with some pretty rough mental frameworks around money. For one, I didn't feel like I was worth that money. It wasn't spent on me. Every penny was pinched, whether or not we could afford things. We grew up with a little bit of food scarcity, despite the fact that we didn't need to. This video is not really about the childhood side of things, and we could dive really deep into that, but basically, it felt like we had to reason and argue our way into our parents spending literally any money on us beyond the absolute bare minimum. They had to keep us alive. I actually asked my family about one story in particular to give you an idea as well, because before I even reached the age of majority, my parents let me talk them into letting me take out a line of credit for a few $1,000s to do the bodywork and paint job on my muscle car, my 1970 Chevelle Malibu. And I reasoned, hey, I can pay this off. It'll work out. I also reasoned that, yes, this is an asset. Obviously, it's a cool muscle car. It's only going to get more valuable with time. And at the same time, it spent all of its time in the garage getting repaired and just sucking me dry for money because it was an old car and it was falling apart. And it was beyond me to keep it in good repair. I rolled that debt into my student loans, and that's kind of how I started out. The other side of this is ambition. Not only am I illiterate and naive on how money works, but I'm very ambitious and raised in a generation that's told if you believe it, you can do it. Just go to college, get a degree, you'll get a job, follow your dreams, somehow they'll magically, lead to profit. My story is fairly complex. That is why I wrote a book about it. It would be silly of me to think that I could actually get you completely caught up in the span of a video. But to summarize, the college degree to job path did not work out for me. I came back from my first year in France teaching English, just putting off adulthood for a little bit longer, to a recession. The job that I had lined up for myself back in the States, a pretty good job actually, fell through because of said recession. I bounced around between temp jobs for a long time. It got really, really miserable. It was good to reread the book to remember how miserable it was. I ended up volunteering on a hospital ship in West Africa between the middle of 2010 and the beginning of 2014. Volunteers don't make money. I deferred my student loans as much as I could. I had a little bit of consumer debt, and I came out of my volunteering phase into a job consulting for 2 years, where I actually made some decent money. However, I still hadn't learned how to handle money well yet. What I could have done during this period is earned a fair amount of money, saved, paid down what debt I did have, and then figure out what I was going to do next. But I knew there was a shelf life on this consulting gig because it was for a temporary change in the electronic medical record landscape in America. And like I said, I'm ambitious, and I've always wanted to tell stories, and I had been writing and publishing books ever since 2010, and I wanted those to go somewhere. And I had a job that paid me to fly somewhere every weekend. Every 3 to 4 days, I was on an airplane with a rental car in a new place, and then on the weekends, I was wherever I wanted to be in America because I didn't have a home for them to send me to. So the clients that I worked with agreed to just let me get tickets to wherever I wanted, which was really good for seeing the country in a way that I never had before, and also really good for running from my problems. I kept writing, and I took the money that I was making and invested it into artwork, into voice acting, into projects that were really big and really ambitious. I bought space in sci-fi and fantasy conventions so that I could hawk my books. I really, really invested heavily into it, and at the same time lost track of my money, partially because, again, not literate with money yet at this point in my life, and also because I was a consultant. And there are two types of consulting. One where they give you a company credit card and you put all your expenses like your hotel, your airfare, your car, your food, all that onto that. It's taken care of. You don't have to worry about it. The other one being where you pay for everything and get reimbursed later, and that way you get all the points for air miles, hotel points, car rental miles. You get the point. That was the version that I was on. The issue was that they would make us book multiple weeks of airfare in advance, hotels, all of that, but never reimburse us until we had actually taken the flight or made the stay in the hotel, which meant that you were carrying potentially months of credit in advance and then not being able to pay that off also for months. Roll that into a couple of years of nonstop life on the road. And I actually don't really blame myself for totally losing track of this. I should have had a spreadsheet. I should have kept religious track of it so I didn't get screwed. But again, I hadn't really learned how to do any of that yet. And I found myself prey to an increasing debt load that I really wasn't fully aware of because I always kind of looked at it and thought, this is going to get paid off later. Like, I'm keeping track of it in expense reports. And this brings us to the other hard lesson that I did not learn for a long time. I might still be learning to a little degree, and that is understanding reality and my place in it. How the world actually works, how money actually works, how interest actually works. All of that ended up bundling up to really just become an overwhelming, incredible burden. All throughout this, I'm undergoing heartbreak, some really deep stress. I haven't started therapy yet, so there's all kinds of just dark, heavy shit that's weighing me down that I'm not really fully aware of. I'm angrier than I've ever been. It starts out being really lonely and just painfully, agonizingly lonely. Life on the road. And then it turns into an anger and a sense of helplessness. I find myself working jobs where nothing really matters. I show up to do something that nobody really wants me there to be doing, and I feel like garbage when I can't get anything done because there's actually nothing to do, but we have to pretend to work so we don't get fired. It was pretty miserable. And then progressively, the projects that I had lined up, 2 books in particular, and a tech startup that I started with some friends, all fell flat on their face, one after the other. And every opportunity for escape just disappeared, like right in front of me. As the consulting gig dried up and I jumped headlong into those projects that would start to fail, I did so from a place where I had a little bit of savings, but that pile of debt had grown pretty substantially and was only going to keep growing as I, lived off of what little savings I had, and then also lived off of a little bit more credit. And man, those credit cards, like you live the consulting life long enough and they give you so much credit that you can just, it's a lot of rope that you can just hang yourself with before you know it. As the Kickstarter for the first book failed, I realized I needed to get a job, and I did get a job. I got multiple jobs, just whatever I could to stay afloat. Then the publishing deal that I had lined up failed, and I was feeling really cornered and very screwed. And then finally, the last Kickstarter failed while I was here in Paris. Those last 2, the publishing deal and the second Kickstarter, actually happened when I started daily vlogging back in 2016. So you can go back and see at least some of the pain that I was going through, but not a lot, because I was really ashamed to share just how hard things were, just how far from succeeding I felt. I really felt like an epic failure because everything I touched just seemed to die. Didn't matter how hard I worked. It didn't matter how cool it was, at least to me. It didn't matter how impressive the team I was working with was. Everything I did just seemed to fail. The pressure of paying for all of it grew exponentially. And that leads us to the question, why didn't I do this sooner? Pride and shame and fear, driven by ignorance, are really at the root of that. Pride because, like I said, I grew up with a bunch of manly men who paid their debts. Even if you were to look at a guy and think well, that was out of his control, he got into a really bad circumstance, there would always be that underlying current of yeah, but he should have known better. He really should have known better, and now he should figure out a way to get out of it instead of pulling this ripcord. That leads to shame because clearly there must be something wrong with me if I can't figure out how to get out of this situation. I'm not smart enough. I'm not working hard enough. I don't know what I'm doing. Something's wrong with me. And it felt like a moral failing. And the ignorance side of things, which led to fear, was that I wanted to move back to France. I had lived here twice before. I dreamed of living in Paris. It was my goal that if I could get back here, I would stay here long enough to earn French citizenship so no one could ever kick me out again. Spoiler, that worked out eventually. But at this point in my life, I didn't know if it would. And what I really didn't know was if getting a bankruptcy, it's a black mark on your record. So if you declare for bankruptcy, there's Chapter 7 and Chapter 11. Chapter 7 says, I can't pay anything. I need full protection. Please help to the government. And then they come in and assess it, protect you to a certain point, and discharge all your debt that you're eligible to have discharged. Chapter 11, and then there's Chapter 13. There are multiple. I'm not an expert, like I said. But that's basically how do we reorganize your debts and look at everything to create a payment plan so that you can keep going, but pay everything down. And it's very limiting, and for situations where you hopefully can restructure and find a way out of it. So what happens when companies file for bankruptcy to discharge a certain amount of their debt and keep operating. I didn't know if doing that would end up hurting my ability to get a visa and coming to France. And I didn't want it to screw me over. I had friends that were advising that I go bankrupt, people whose families had done so before. My buddy Joe sat me down and really tried to get me to do it in this period where I was just going insane. And I just couldn't do it because I was too proud and because I was ashamed of the fact that maybe I would need that kind of help, that I couldn't do it on my own. We talked about this a little bit in the video that I made recently about my relationship with my mom. I'm estranged from her and a significant portion of my family, unfortunately. And part of that is rooted in the fact that I was actually neglected as a kid. That neglect, which we're going to talk too much about the childhood stuff today, but that neglect, it turns out, leads to attachment issues, obviously, but a form of complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which leads to a very strong sense of a need to be self-reliant. It's easy to look at that and think, I'm just being very independent. But in reality, when you're a child and you can't rely on any adults in your life to take care of you, and you don't feel safe with the adults in your life who are supposed to be taking care of you, it leaves you in a position where obviously you need to do whatever you can to survive. You don't trust anybody else to help you survive. And that leads to this narrow-minded self-reliance, which is actually really, really unhealthy, but also really hard to break out of, and something I wouldn't break out of until much later. But that is a driving force underneath this inability to let go, this inability to ask for help. Because in reality, bankruptcy is a tool that's offered by the government, at least in the US, wherever you are, look into what it could be for you. But in reality, that tool is there. It's just, it comes with its own consequences. You have to make a decision. It's going to be a mark on your record for 7 years. It will impact your life if you live in the States. But at the same time, there's no shame in taking the help when the help is offered and you really need it, especially if the consequences of not taking the help are worse than the consequences of taking the help. Which brings us to why I finally did it. I powered through as best I could. And if you've been following me for a long time, you know that I ended up stumbling basically into my visa to move back to Paris. Thankfully, I had this apartment waiting for me. It was not nearly this cozy back then. It was fairly empty with really old furniture that was really uncomfortable. Thankfully, when I lived here previously, my landlady, an absolute saint, and my number one patron, Kiki, thank you forever. Kiki was kind and generous enough when I stayed here the first time to say that I could use this apartment whenever I wanted. Her words were, "It's yours until I die." And I didn't actually really believe her when she said it at first, because again, the hyper self-reliance and not trusting people, I was like, really? I don't know if that's true. But she meant it. It turns out she actually meant it. She liked having me in this tiny little maid's chamber. I'm in the building next to her apartment. Her apartment's in the building next door. When she came through Paris, because she didn't live here full time, she liked having somebody here. And she's just a kind, lovely human being, and she completely changed my life. So having this apartment here meant free rent. And it also meant that I had an address, which made some of the hoop jumping easier. But it didn't help me get my visa. That's a whole other story. I got very lucky. I got my visa. I got here. There was supposed to be work waiting for me when I got here. I jumped through a whole bunch more hoops for a while. When I finally got offered the job, it wasn't for another 6 months, and I was screwed. So I took a job as a bike tour guide, which is in my vlog back in the day. I worked every day that entire summer just to make ends meet. And it got to the point, as you heard at the beginning of this video, where I was making just over $2,000 a month. And all of that money from all those tours I was doing every day, 2 tours a day in Paris or 1 out in Versailles, every single penny was getting bundled up and shipped back to America just to make the minimum payments on my debt. And that was all I had. And I was eating like a demi baguette for breakfast on my way to work, and then thankfully would get free food from the places we took the tourists. So there was always a hookup there to get some food. And then if my tourists tipped me, which thank God for American tourists, because they are the best tippers. Australian tourists, get out of here. But thankfully, the American tourists were always really generous, and that was the only way that I could eat. And it led to a bit of a drinking problem that summer, for sure. I don't know if it was a problem. I needed to blow off steam. I'm not proud of that summer. I'm not proud of my behavior in this period of my life in so many ways. There is a version of me that I have left behind, and that I'm so grateful to have left behind. But thankfully, people did give me a little bit of money, and that was what I had to eat. I was looking for all the legal documentation from my lawyer and everything. I actually found a series of thoughts that I saved in an email draft that I never sent to myself that were just detailing how stressful things were and how frustrating they were. How even when I decided I cannot carry the weight of this anymore, I have to do something about it, especially when tourism season started winding down and I simply couldn't make enough money to pay my debts anymore. And you look at it and you say, now I'm actually going to ruin this credit score that I'm trying to protect for some reason by maintaining a good standing with my payments. I won't be able to make that. It's going to deteriorate. Everything's going to fall apart. I can't afford to do this anymore. Why am I doing this? So I called a lawyer. I happened to find one who was actually willing to work with me from abroad. We figured everything out. I applied for it. And I was so stressed the entire time because, for one, it wasn't guaranteed that it was going to go through, that it was going to work. They were telling me stuff like, it still looks like you make a little too much money to qualify for this. I'm like, how is that possible? There were so many just moments where I was like, I felt desperate. I needed help so badly, and it didn't seem like it was going to come through. I had holes in my jeans where I was describing how I only had 2 pairs of pants left, one of which had a huge hole in the groin. The other one had just developed the same problem. And here I was debating how to go take people on bike tours with massive holes in the groin and not be embarrassed the entire, like I was just in the depths of like completely trapped, no money, no way out. And then the lawyer was like, just stop paying them. I had to pay the lawyers. So I was just like, stop paying them and pay me instead. Your credit rating is about to get tanked anyways. And then we'll sort it from there. It was still a very stressful period. I had to fly back to the States. I had to actually sit in front of a judge, prove that I was who I said I was, hope that my creditors didn't show up to take what little I owned. But in reality, there's this limit. It turns out there's an exemption for like assets under $160,000. They can't take your house if you live in your house. If you have two cars, they might take one, but they're not taking both of them. They actually protect you from just having your entire life ruined. And I didn't own anything. I didn't own a car. I didn't own a house. I have this sad list of like my assets, and they're like domain names and my books and drafts of my book. Like I just want to protect all my IP. I want to exempt everything just in case they want to take my stuff. They didn't give a crap. I didn't own anything. I don't own enough. I'm so poor, basically. I don't own anything. I don't own this stuff. I don't pay rent. Like even the business never turned a profit. My books have never sold enough to be worth anything. Like nothing I have is worth anything, which is definitely a good way to humble yourself. If you ever want to take full stock of how much you own and realize it's nothing. The total value, I have it written down here, the total value of everything I owned when I filed was $2,695, which is about $157,000 below the threshold of needing to worry about it. But I was still super, super stressed because the lawyer made it sound like I might be screwed. You don't know. Like the paralegal I was talking with kept me on the ropes. I was pretty stressed. So on November 8th of 2017, I filed for bankruptcy officially. And on February 7th, 2018, it was officially discharged and I could breathe a little easier. Now, it's interesting because I went back and I looked at the video where I finally shared about this because I was too scared to talk about it publicly until it was all over. My dad and my lawyer were both like, yeah, please don't. And even when I did talk about it, I could not tell you that I was bankrupt at the beginning of the video. It took me 15 minutes into that like 23-minute long video just to say, I went bankrupt. I was not very direct. I was really scared. I was really ashamed still. I was really struggling with the fear that others would judge me for it. And that leads to what I learned from this whole thing. Number one is that I wasn't failing entirely. I felt like a massive failure, but as soon as I discharged that debt, all the side jobs that I had assembled, I was translating and doing voice acting work. I was teaching English. I was a bike tour guide. I was teaching classes for a tech company back in the States. And Patreon had been growing this entire time as well. I wasn't making a ton of money, but I realized I was making enough to live. Combined with a free place to live, I was okay. I would not feel like I was okay for years. That level of stress and anxiety about my future and how tenuous it had felt would not leave for a very long time. But I came to realize, like, hold on, maybe I'm not totally failing at this working for myself thing after all. The next thing I learned was nobody cares. The French government obviously did not care. They didn't even know that an American credit score existed, had no impact on my life here, would have had no impact on leaving America. Wish I would have known that sooner. Really wish I would have known that sooner. But also, I'm sure there are people that judge me for it. I'm sure there are people that look at me differently for it. But who cares? Everybody that was closest to me wanted me to do it, supported me through it, and still loved me on the other side. And the fact of the matter is that sometimes you just got to do what you got to do. And who cares what anybody outside of your closest friends and family think? I don't. There are people, I'm sure, in my family that think less of me for it. I'm sure there are people that I grew up with that think less of me for it. Who cares? I'm free. And one really, really important line through all of this is the reason I got myself in this situation was because I over leveraged myself in my ambitions. I was trying to build multiple businesses over the course of time. I absorbed a lot of debt. I took on a lot of risk and I failed really hard. But business failure is not a moral failure. Just because I failed in these ways doesn't make me a failure. Guilt is the fear that we've done something wrong, and shame is the fear that we're what's wrong. But shame can't survive being brought into the light. And that's also part of the reason that it was really important that I shared this previously, but very important for me to bring this out to you today. Because even though I don't really hold a whole lot of shame or any shame for this now, I know there are people out there that are struggling with this exact circumstance. Maybe not exact, but bankruptcy, failing at business, being crushed by debt. I can't absolve you of all your sins. I can't absolve you of any of your sins. Only you can do that, really. And the way you do that is by bringing it to the light, by confessing it if you're religious, by sharing it with your friends if you are or if you aren't. By bringing these things into the light, it withers away. It can't live. It can't survive. And it's really, really important to recognize that we live in a system that is geared to profit off of our suffering. It was funny because I totally forgot about it, but once I got back into this book, one of the early jobs that I talked about was how I got tricked into working for a payday loan company. I was told that I was going to be building websites for like a marketing leads company with shoes and cars and stuff, and I got into it, and it was just payday loans. And payday loans, if you're unaware, are short-term, very high-interest loans that are very high risk and ultimately end up getting you caught in a cycle of debt. That entire industry is built around predatory lending. Like they lend it to people who are vulnerable in hopes that they'll get trapped and owe them money forever at a high interest rate so they won't ever be able to pay it off, and they'll just make endless amounts of money off of that initial first investment. When we live in a system that not only enables that, but pushes it, how can that be anything wrong with you? This is a systemic failing, and it's not one that's on your shoulders. We do need to be educated. We do need to take responsibility. I've had to learn a lot, and the only way to stay out of these traps is to learn to be diligent and to be responsible. So that is on me for sure. And I definitely have paid heavy consequences for my poor decisions in the past. But one of the really important lessons that I've learned at the same time is that while I need to take responsibility and while I need to improve and to grow and to do better moving forward, which I thankfully have, a lot of the deck was also stacked against me from the beginning. Declaring bankruptcy was one of the biggest, hardest things I've ever done in my life, and it also saved my life in some very real ways, and it could save yours. So if you're struggling with overwhelming amounts of debt, don't ask me about it. Like, I'm not going to help because, again, not a lawyer, not a financial advisor, but maybe look into that if it's something that could help you out. I had a lot more to learn. I had some really big curveballs on the way. So I'm going to make another video about the bankruptcy times until now, like how I managed to navigate some really hard stuff, some lessons I learned, and some lessons I probably still need to learn. And I'm making this into a bit of a 3-part series, starting with bankruptcy, going with like how I went from bankruptcy to like, actually, I think being a pretty self-sufficient business person, despite the French government trying to destroy me multiple times. And then from there, what are we going to do? How do I see the future, both for myself, but also for the creator economy, for anybody that wants to be out there making art, content, working creatively for themselves. And yeah, I'll put that up here as soon as it's available. But if it's not there yet, it's because this video is too fresh. Thanks to Roy Ehlenberg, today's patron producer. I randomize everybody at the Wanderer level and above to be patron producers, but you're seeing all the rest of my lovely patrons on screen right now. They have absolutely changed my life, and I am so grateful. And if you didn't know this, whether or not you're an active patron, because these credits are just my active patrons, all of my patrons of all time are credited in the back of this book all the way up till about 2020. So if you were a patron at any point before that and you didn't know that, your name's in this book, and I hope that you find it and can highlight it someday and know that I am eternally grateful.
Do you have anything to add, Brian?
I do not. Good job.
Thanks, Brian.